Real quick, before we start this podcast episode, I just want to say thank you for tuning into the Marc podcast. I know you've got a million things that you could be doing right now, and the fact that you're taking time out of your day to watch this podcast episode truly means the world to me, and I just want to say thank you for that. If you'd like to continue to support the podcast, right below this video, if you could hit the subscribe button, and then, hey, if you got some more time and you want to hit the download button, the comment button, the like button, the share button, any of those buttons, it's greatly, greatly appreciated. It helps for other people to find out about the podcast, and it helps for you to be notified about future episodes. So if you guys could take a quick second, hit the subscribe button, I would really appreciate that. Outside of that, this episode and every other episode is brought to you guys by Roast Umber Coffee. As some of you guys know, I co-founded Roast Umber Coffee, and we have the greatest farmers in Guatemala and Honduras and the greatest roaster in Grand Rapids, Michigan, all to bring you guys the greatest cup of coffee possible. So if you'd like to try it out, go to our website, use the coupon code MARC30, and you're going to get 30% off your coffee. Now on to the episode. Thank you guys again for tuning in. Welcome to the Marc Podcast. I get nervous sometimes with these sort of conversations because I just want it to go so well. And I know how important these conversations are because there's going to be somebody who's listening to this, watching this, whatever, that is currently in a situation where they're dating a narcissist. And so I'm like, I want this to actually help people. But as a result of it, I get nervous of I just want to make sure I don't mess it up. So
you're such an empath,
Marc. Try to be. So, all right. So to start it off, can you tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming.
Hi, I'm Natalie Jambazian. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I specialize in narcissistic abuse recovery, anxiety, and PTSD.
There we go. So to kind of set the floor, can you give your definition of what is a narcissist? Let's just start off with that.
I think to understand narcissism, I would first describe the symptoms of narcissistic traits. So narcissists are very grandiose with how they do things and how they say things. They lack empathy. They are very charming and charismatic. They don't take any responsibility or accountability. They are pathological liars. They are future fakers. I can go on and on and on, but those are really the main points. And also, I'd like to add that they love attention and admiration by their partner.
Sounds like a president that we used to have. We won't get into that. But
true that.
But that sounds like the definition that I read from the Mayo Clinic. So the Mayo Clinic, they described a narcissist as a disorder in which a person has an inflated sense of self-importance. Narcissistic personality disorder is found more commonly in men. Shocker. The cause is unknown, but likely involves a combination of genetic and environmental factors. Symptoms include an excessive need for admiration, disregard for others' feelings, an inability to handle any criticism, and a sense of entitlement. So before the podcast, you mentioned to me that you yourself were a survivor of a narcissistic abusive relationship. And so can you tell me a little bit more about that? What was that like? How did you realize that you were in a narcissistic abuse relationship?
Yeah. I think as you were talking, I was thinking what an oxymoron, right? As a therapist and, dealing with a narcissistic relationship myself. But, I think going to school at the time, they didn't really talk about narcissism. It kind of skimmed through it. So it was kind of a shocker when I caught myself in a narcissistic relationship. I didn't know it was narcissism. I just felt really exhausted and depressed and very anxious. And I knew there was something wrong, right? So I went to a therapist, and my therapist straight up told me, I think you're with a narcissist. I was like, what's that? Tell me more. And it all just made so much more sense. I think I felt so much more relieved knowing, I guess, there is a description to it. And it was just, just recognizing that really kind of helped me understand what type of relationship I was in and what to do next.
I think narcissism is really interesting because when you think about when you think of a disorder for the most part, or when I think of a medical disorder, I think of something where you take a test and it's you test positive for X, Y, and Z, right? And so when it comes to something like narcissism, there's no test that someone takes where it's and your blood work shows that you're a narcissist, right? And so I feel as a result of that, there's probably plenty of people that are in a relationship with somebody who is a narcissist, but then they'll say to their partner or whatever, oh, you're a narcissist. And the person's no, I'm not.
Yeah.
And it's Okay, so you're just in this awkward dilemma of like, you're dating a narcissist and they just don't believe they're a narcissist, and they probably don't believe they're a narcissist because they're a narcissist. So it's just one of those awkward things of like something like that, a personality disorder that there's no like test to prove that you're a narcissist. And so what qualities, I guess, did your ex show that made you realize that you were in a narcissistic abusive relationship?
Well, he was extremely successful. I think a lot of narcissists are very successful in what they do. He had a high ego. He also was very manipulative, and he was more of a covert narcissist, which means that he was very different in public than he was behind closed doors. So he was extremely charismatic. He was very helpful to a lot of people. He was kind of environmentalist and philanthropist and just incredibly amazing in the public's eye, right? But behind closed doors, there was a lot of ignoring and stonewalling and acting hot and cold. I think that's where it kind of threw me off. There was moments where everything was so great and adventurous, and the next day he was extremely cold, and he would just ignore me and ignore my messages and just not talk to me all day. And he would rationalize it as like, I'm really busy and, I'm, working. And I also think that was just an excuse, and I think he slowly kind of groomed me to feel anxious in moments where I just, wanted to talk to him or have a conversation with him. But he would have quote unquote meetings at night at like 9 o'clock, So there was a lot of, there's lying happening and a lot of gaslighting, right? Because when I would let him know like, hey, I think, are you sure you're at dinner? Like, I mean, it sounds kind of like you might be on a date or something, And he's like, no, what are you talking about? You're the only one, right? So there was a lot of just pathological lying going on.
Did it result in a lot of self-doubt? Because I feel like if you're dating somebody, or even if you're like friends with somebody who is like, from a public standpoint, they look one type of way, and then when they're privately with you, they're a whole nother type of way. I feel like that's got to cause you to be like, am I losing my shit? Like, am I the crazy one here? Does that how it makes you feel?
Absolutely. I thought I was going crazy. And I feel like a lot of survivors feel like they're going crazy because, narcissists gaslight you so much so you doubt yourself, thinking like, wait a minute, like, oh, maybe, I might be wrong, or I'm at fault for thinking that, that person's on a date, or, is talking to a girl, when they say like, no, I'm not, right? So when consistently someone says like, no, what are you talking about? That's not true. You're going to start doubting yourself, at least survivors who are in narcissistic relationships, they do.
Okay. So did your own experience then play a role in you getting into the field that you're in now?
Yeah, definitely. I felt like as I was going to therapy and my therapist was really helping me heal through the trauma, I felt like a calling. I felt like I can reach out to a lot of, people who are struggling to feel less crazy, or for someone to believe them, even coming from a professional standpoint. So I felt like it was a calling for me to do this work.
And so, okay, so when you're going into a therapy session like that, and you're talking to your therapist, and you realize that you're in a narcissistic abusive relationship, is pretty much the end goal of that therapy session, like, and obviously course of various therapy sessions, to get you to end that relationship? Because I feel like it's something where then your therapist almost becomes like a dating counselor or like a marriage counselor in some way. Like, but so explain that, I guess, like, what is the goal of, once you're in that situation, therapist helps you recognize that, is the goal then to get you to leave that relationship?
Yeah, I think so. For my therapist never told me to like, hey, this is really wrong, get out, right? Yeah. And, some therapists are very different in the way they approach things. But I felt like what helped me the most in therapy was really recognizing like why I would choose a partner like that, right? Why would I want to be with someone who is inconsistent, unpredictable, hot and cold, right? And I think it was recognizing like my childhood, right? What I've been through, and understanding my childhood and anything that has kind of affected me in choosing a partner like that. And really kind of connecting the dots of like, okay, what is it about him that attracted me to him, and why am I staying, right? So there is this connection of connecting the dots, and that would be, I would say, the first, couple of months of sessions to work through.
Okay, so I have a few questions on that. So then when you're working with a client, let's say you're working with a client who's in a narcissistic abusive relationship, is it tough for you as like a human to not just like kind of get out of therapist mode and just be like, hey, just fucking leave this guy. Like, this guy fucking sucks. You can do obviously better than this. Like, is it tough to kind of be in, like, stay in therapist mode and, like, help them work through it to the point where, like, they realize that on their own? When in, like, if you were talking to one of your close friends and they were telling you the same situation, you would just probably be like, okay, you need to dump him, right? So is it difficult to kind of stay in therapist mode when you kind of know what needs to happen, but you got to let them figure it out themselves?
I think it's really difficult to see the person really going through it in the midst of all of it. I think for me, I've really worked on healing in many ways, and I'm in a different place in my life right now versus, let's say, my clients can be in the beginning of phase where they just discovered they're a narcissist, like what to do next. It does get a little difficult, but also I would say the same thing to my friend. And I wouldn't say just leave, because I feel like that kind of comes from a judgmental place. And survivors in narcissistic relationships are in a different type of relationship compared to like breaking up in a normal relationship, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So you're kind of trauma bonded in this relationship. It's not easy as like, hey, you have to leave because this is unhealthy. There's this trauma bond, which is like this chemical imbalance that you have where it kind of gets you stuck with this person, and it's hard to leave, and it takes a very long time to get out.
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, yeah, the more I think about it, like, I guess if you're telling somebody, yeah, you should just break up with this person, odds are, like, they're A, they're not going to take your advice, and, like, yeah, B, it's not really helping the situation. If you're more kind of guiding them to, like, help them figure it out themselves, it's going to, most likely end in a better result. So, yeah. Okay, so then the second question that you had, or second question I had, a second ago, you mentioned the, what about yourself, I guess, attracted a narcissist, right? So are there certain, like, I guess, characteristics or certain things that maybe has happened to somebody in their past that results in them eventually attracting narcissists, and how does that all work?
Yeah, it's a good question. So individuals who are attracted to narcissists are highly sensitive people and empathic people. And when I say highly sensitive, it's not a bad thing. I think there's people who are more sensitive and hypervigilant than others. And empaths are very much attracted to narcissists and vice versa, because they have this hero complex where they feel like they can fix someone, or they're like, they could be caregivers and they can help that person. Or if they give enough love, this person might just change. And I think the hope when you're in a narcissistic relationship becomes dysfunctional because narcissists don't really change.
Okay, so actually, let's talk about that. So I had asked you the question, and then you started to give me an answer before we started the podcast, and I was like, wait, we got to do that on a podcast. So, yeah. Is it possible, in your opinion, and you can kind of give a different, if you have two different opinions, one as like a therapist and one as just a normal person, like what your thoughts are. Can a narcissist change? Like, what happens if a narcissist comes to you and is like, I want to change? I guess, would they be a narcissist if they actually truly want to change? I don't know, but what's your opinion? Can a narcissist change?
Well, narcissism is a spectrum, right? A very wide spectrum. So there's people who have narcissistic traits that are like lower on the spectrum, and there's people that are higher on the spectrum, right? There's like very covert, manipulative narcissist that like really is embedded in their soul. It's a disorder. So it's, they don't really recognize there's anything wrong with them at all. They don't see it as like, oh, I'm not showing empathy, or, I'm being manipulative, or I'm lying. They actually do not feel any remorse. So it really depends on the narcissist. It's just recognizing like where they are on the spectrum. If, and I personally don't think narcissists change it. will change, because, doing this work over the years, I've never met a narcissist that has changed, nor have I ever met a survivor's narcissist that I've heard that, they dramatically changed for the better. And if they have, it's very short-lived.
Yeah, I mean, I always wonder, just like, obviously I'm 30, and like growing up, you have friends who are talking to you about their dating situation, telling you situations and whatnot. And you always hear the like, the deep down, they're a really good person, right? Like, Mark, I promise you, like deep down, they're really a good person. And I always kind of feel like when somebody says that means that when they first were dating that person, things were really good. They had great experiences with that
honeymoon
person.
Stage.
Yeah, and then things have gone to shit, and now they just don't want to believe that person's kind of a piece of shit, for lack of better words, and like they just don't want to come to grips with that, because in a way, it's almost like, do you almost judge yourself a little bit for like, why did I end up with this person? Like, how did I get fooled? Almost like that, and then you hold on to those like earlier memories of like, we had such great times together. So is there a chance that we go back to that? And so I feel like a lot of people just end up stuck in a situation like that. Partly too, also maybe because of pride, because you're embarrassed that like I ended up in a situation like that, and especially when your like friends and family and whatnot recognize it too. I think that's a big part of it. My whole golden rule of thumb is like, if my close friends or family don't like somebody, like it's usually for a good reasons, and so I need to pay attention to that and figure out why that would be, right? But do you think? Why is that, I guess, difficult for people to accept that they may be in a narcissistic abusive relationship? Is it just pride? Is it, what would that be?
I think you brought up a couple of points that I want to talk about. I think one of them is there is a lot of shame and guilt attached to continuing being with a narcissist, even when you find out that he's being manipulative, he or she's being manipulative or lying or cheating or whatever it is, or being physically, emotionally abusive. And it's the trauma bond that keeps people going, right? It's this oxytocin that kicks in. It's this glue that keeps you going with the narcissist. And that is what people just don't really understand, why it's so hard for survivors to leave so fast and so quickly. I think that it's, people who have experienced being in these types of relationship understand. And I think that's why, clients of mine come to me, because I really do understand it's hard to get out and it takes time and patience. But at the same time, there is the shame and guilt knowing that you're with a narcissist and still continuing being with them. So sometimes you don't tell your friends and family because of the shame attached, right? Shame says, I am bad. Guilt says, I'm doing something bad, right? Another thing that you brought up is the hope, right? Like the hope that keeps the survivor going. And even when you find out this person is a narcissist and they're just treating you awful, there's this term called cognitive dissonance. And, whether you leave the relationship or you're still in the relationship, you start thinking about the good times, right? Even though they hurt you emotionally, physically, mentally, sexually at times. But you look back and you're like, oh, that was very exciting and adventurous. And that is why survivors get so caught up. Because in narcissistic relationships, in the beginning, it feels so exciting, right? Have you heard people say like, oh, this relationship seems boring. This date seems boring. Well, because, some people are attracted and attached to this like excitement that they get from kind of toxic relationships. And it's very fun and adventurous, but it's very short-lived, right? There's the cycle of abuse, which is the love bombing we kind of talked about in the past together, right? So the love bombing is like they shower you with affection, which is kind of the honeymoon phase, right? Sometimes they take you to extravagant, trips or, do extravagant things, and it's so exciting. But later on, when they groom you and they wait until you're kind of attached to them, they start devaluing you. So they might kind of criticize like what you do, like your job, your work, criticize your friends, criticize your family. And you start kind of feeling confused at this point. And then they discard you. And during this phase, they kind of stonewall you. They might ignore you. not answer you, or you want to have a conversation with them, but they don't want to talk about it, right? So the cycle kind of continues over and over again. And it's really mind-blowing. It's kind of crazy making, right? So if you think about it, if the cycle continues on and on, it drives anybody crazy.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned something a second ago there. You mentioned like a relationship sometimes can seem boring, and then there's also these other ones that are like these crazy love bombing sort of relationships, right? The way I think about that often is like if I take a second, as you were talking there, I was thinking back to like friends of mine or like family friends or whatever growing up and whatnot. When I would see the relationships that were like over the top lovey-dovey, I feel like almost every one of those has ended in some like fireworks situation, right? Either a dramatic divorce or like XYZ, right? And then the people who just seem like really comfortable with each other, where from the outside, whatever it may look like boring per se, those are the people that end up together for the rest of the time. And it's because they have this like beautiful, like almost like synchronized relationship where like they just work with each other. And so there's not this like whole like trying to jam a square peg into a round hole sort of situation. Like it actually just works. And so as a result of that, it can seem like boring per se, but in reality, it's not boring. It works. And these other situations where it's like this over the top, love bombing, lovey-dovey, crazy shit where they can't keep their hands off each other, stuff like that. Like if I see like two people at a gym working out together and they're holding hands, I'm like, who the fuck does that? Like you're at a gym. Like that makes no sense. And I feel like those sort of relationships, and we all know people like that, I feel like all of those end in these like dramatic fireworks. And it's always almost like from the outside, it's like out of the blue where like all of a sudden they call you and they're like, hey, so-and-so and I, we broke up, and like, guess what happened? And then they start telling you all the shit that like was actually happening in the relationship, and you're like, what? I never knew any of that. And they're like, yeah, well, I didn't want to tell you, blah, blah. And so, yeah, it's really interesting to think about, I guess, like the different types of relationships that we see or have experienced or anything like that. So the other thing that you mentioned there was trauma bonding. So for people who don't know what trauma bonding is, can you explain what that is real quick?
Yeah, so trauma bonding is this neurochemical, just, dopamine high that you get when you have been emotionally, physically, and mentally abused by someone. It's like something in your nervous system that keeps wanting to be with that person. It's an anxious feeling that you get. That you want to be with this person who actually hurt you, right? It's kind of like the Stockholm syndrome where, you're kind of wanting to be with the perpetrator, even when, that person is hurting you or have hurt you. So the victim kind of gets attached to the abuse in a way.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, it's crazy when you think about like how prevalent something like that is. And I feel like a lot of times when people think of abuse, they think of something, it has to be physical, right? And it's like, it doesn't have to be physical abuse for it to be truly abuse. And you also see a lot of times, I've had people say to me, oh, well, he didn't hit me, he just grabbed my arm, right? Or like, he's super kind to me, but then he just like doesn't like it when I go out with my girlfriends and we go to a bar together. And it's like, what? There's just things like that where you just start noticing the little like manipulation and things like that. And then things that are physical abuse that they just kind of pass over because it's not like, oh, he didn't like punch me. It's like, okay, he doesn't have to punch you. And also things scale up over time. Like that's always, I guess, my concern, with anybody that I know that is in a tumultuous relationship like that, is that it doesn't usually start off at like the nth degree. It like gradually moves up to that. And so when you're dating somebody that it's already unhealthy and you're 6 months in, a year in, or whatever, it's like, well, where's that going to end up? You know?
And I was going to add that survivors rationalize behavior, right? They rationalize it to kind of stay in the relationship a little longer because of the trauma bond. So it's like coming up with, like they rationalize like, oh, like they are a narcissist because they had a really abusive, childhood growing up, or they had an abusive parent. So there's a lot of rationalization that that keeps like the survivor going in the narcissistic relationship.
So, okay, so I have a few more questions for you that are that people asked on Twitter and Instagram. I kind of put some polls out there, just said if they had any questions for you to ask those. Okay. And so a pretty common one was, is it normal to miss a toxic ex? They said they find themselves thinking back on some of the good times they had, feeling pity, feeling wanted, but they're also starting to recognize that these behaviors are byproducts of the trauma that they went through. So, yeah, is that normal for people to miss a toxic ex?
Absolutely. I think that's what we talked about. It's trauma bonding. That's what it's called. I think that, you kind of look back at when you're not in the relationship anymore, you look back at the relationship and you're thinking about the good memories, right? But, usually the bad behavior and the bad memories outweigh the good. So I always let my clients know to remember how they were treated and remember how, awful and manipulative their partner was.
So are you familiar with Colleen Hoover?
I don't think so.
Oh, great author, but you got to read her books.
Oh, wait, it's the one, This Is Us,
yes. It starts with us, it ends with us, and then she has Verity, bunch of books.
Yes, I've read the first book. I'm on the second one because of you, because I saw you posting it.
Hey, there we go. Yeah, she's incredible. But in one of the books, she mentions that something along the lines of like, she wrote down the bad memories that she had with her ex so that when he would try to come back into her life and like he was being very nice to her and whatnot, she would have something to read to remind her of what they had already been through, right? Yeah. Now, I'm talking about a fictional book here, but obviously that's a story that a lot of people can probably relate to. Is that something you would recommend to a client if they're, let's say they've gotten out of a narcissistic abusive relationship or just an abusive relationship in general, and they want to make sure that they never go back to somebody like that, or, to that specific person or anybody else like that? Is there anything that you would recommend for them to kind of keep themselves from ending up in that situation again?
Yeah, I might be biased when it comes to therapy, but I really do think that it's really important to, go to a therapist, because therapists usually help you rewire your brain, right? It takes time. And what happens when you're in toxic relationships is like your brain gets used to the manipulation and you feel the need to be in those types of relationships. So we want to rewire the brain. And I don't know if Colleen Hoover have ever seen a therapist, but that is a great way it's a great exercise to kind of write it down so that you remember what happened to you and there's no cognitive dissonance where you're only remembering the good memories and not the bad ones.
Is there a reason why our brain does that? Like, is it just because it's a comforting thing to kind of remember like the good memories and kind of push away the bad memories as like a way of trying to get past that trauma?
So there's two things that happens. It's repetition, right? When you are so repetitively being abused, you think that's what you deserve and you feel like, okay, this is familiar to me too. And the other part is the childhood part, right? So you feel like, oh, I'm unworthy of love. This is the best that I can get. I'm not going to find anybody better than this person.
So, okay, and then another question I have for you on top of that. So I feel like a lot of times when somebody dates somebody where it's like this terrible, terrible relationship, that when they get into the next relationship after that, a lot of times they compare the person that they're dating now to the person they were dating before. And a lot of times they'll say, well, he's better in this way, this way, this way, and this way. But when you like really look at it, it's like, well, maybe this new person's not that great either, but they're just not as bad as the previous person, right? So how does somebody, I guess, like get away from like comparing somebody to an ex, but instead like compare things to a standard of like, I know I deserve this, this, and this, and if you're not meeting that, then you're not meeting my standard, versus like comparing somebody to an ex who was terrible, and it's like, well, if your ex was so terrible, obviously anything is better than that, right? So comparing somebody instead to a standard, is there a way that you would, I guess, like recommend people to kind of change the way they see things like that?
Yeah, I think that when someone is like newly dating after being in toxic relationships, I think that it's important to recognize like the red flags, and you can always recognize a red flag in the beginning. Sometimes people are so manipulative that to a regular brain, it's hard to notice that, and that's okay too. But the point is to not to extend that to happen over and over again. So one of the things I tell my clients to look for is consistency, right? If they are telling you that they're going to do something, they need to do it. For example, hey, I'm going to call you tomorrow at 8, and they don't. Hey, I'll call you tomorrow at 1. They don't. right? So consistency, I think, is key, and it's a green flag to look for in a relationship.
I look at consistency as like possibly my favorite thing about anybody, whether it's somebody that I'm dating, somebody I'm friends with, somebody I'm working with. Like, consistency is something that, to me, the older I get, I'm like, it's non-negotiable, because I don't want to have to wonder if you're going to do the things that you say you're going to do. I don't want to have to wonder if you're lying to me or whatever. Like, I just want somebody to be straight up, bluntly honest, all that sort of shit. And I feel like there's a lot of times that, especially in my youth, where I would just kind of like make excuses for people and things like that. And now I'm at a point, I just turned 30 a few weeks ago, and now I'm completely at the point where I'm like,
welcome to the 30s.
Hey, there we go. Air high five.
Yeah.
But yeah, you know, it's just like consistency is something that is, it's just nice. It's comforting to be around when you know that somebody is not going to bullshit you. They're going to be consistently the way they are. And I think that doesn't mean that person won't have hard times and things like that.
Sure.
That's part of life. But the way that they treat you is consistently with respect, consistently with, just consistently good.
Yeah.
So,
I also tell my clients to write their non-negotiables. So, my non-negotiable is that, consistency is a non-negotiable, or boundaries is a non-negotiable for me.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, so another question. Well, yep, somebody already asked the question of, is it possible for a narcissist to change? And then I guess they had an additional question on top of that. They said, do you find people hold on to the hope that, because they're afraid to throw away the time they've invested into that individual, or they're hoping for the good qualities that person once showed to appear again? Do you think that's one of the biggest reasons why people stay in a relationship far longer than they probably should?
Yes, because it's so confusing in these types of relationship, because they do actually come back acting all great and wonderful again, right? So this back and forth, hot and cold, is what keeps also a lot of people stuck in these toxic relationships, because they want that love bombing kick again. They want to get that high feeling again, and it's really hard to get out. And I feel like it takes a little bit of time, and that's okay. But I think it's important to, once somebody recognizes they're with a narcissist, usually people get out.
Yeah.
At some point.
I think it's interesting too, because there's always the whole I've changed sort of mindset, right? And a lot of times, I feel like every time you hear that, it's such bullshit. And a lot of it is because I look at it of, okay, so we're all a product of our environment, right? We're a product of how we grew up. We're a product of what we've experienced. We're, a product of the trauma that we've experienced, the good things we've experienced, all the above, right? And so if somebody, as a result of their experiences, is one type of way, a narcissist for whatever reason, right? How are they going to it's not going to be a month later that person's going to be like, hey, I'm no longer a narcissist. Hey, I was a narcissist for 25 years, but now I'm not, because I realized I don't want to be. It's just not possible for somebody to change like that in a month.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever seen TikTok videos of people who say they're narcissists and they're coming from a narcissistic standpoint and saying, I am a narcissist and I lack empathy, and I want to tell you, whoever is in these types of relationships, that this is how we are.
That's a trend on TikTok?
Yes. It is. It's on TikTok. It's on Instagram. It's out there. I had somebody sent it to me, and they asked what I thought about it. And I was kind of confused, and they knew exactly what they were saying. They were coming from that narcissistic standpoint. I'm still very skeptical about it, I have to say. I feel remember, narcissists like attention. So if they are narcissists and they're talking about narcissism, they're liking the attention that they're getting.
That's interesting. That's interesting. No, but TikTok is its own interesting little world. I try to avoid it, or otherwise I'll end up watching videos for 6 hours about the most random shit.
Yeah.
But another question that we had was, what do you recommend for somebody who wants to open up more, but as a result of their trauma, they react to stressors by being more closed off, emotionally unavailable, just because they're used to dealing with things alone? Maybe they were in a past narcissistic relationship, and so now maybe they're trying to date somebody else new now, and they're just having a hard time opening up because of their past trauma. What would you recommend to that person?
I think as a partner, it's important to come from a compassionate and empathetic place, and really be patient with your partner, and recognize that it's going to take a little bit of time for them to build trust right? Because they were lied to in their past relationship. They were, cheated on and manipulated. So I think with if you're with the healthy partner, it's going to take some time, and it's just about patience and, letting your partner know, I'm here for you if you want to talk, and just allowing them the space to come and talk to you.
I think one of the things that's always been interesting to me too is that a lot of people, when they talk about like their exes or whatnot, there's certain people have different rules in terms of what they think about that, right? Like some people, it's completely a red flag if somebody talks about their ex or whatever.
True.
The way I look at it is like, it's complete transparency. If I don't know what you've been through, then how do I know like why you react to certain things the way you react to certain things? How can I say I know you if I don't know what you've been through, right?
I agree with that.
So I'm a big believer of like complete full transparency. So then I know if you're having a hard time because there was an emotional trigger that you dealt with at that moment that reminded you of past trauma that you've experienced, I can kind of know how to better handle that versus if I don't know what you've been through, and then I'm just kind of guessing. And so I feel like a lot of times there's this like whole social stigma of like, don't talk about your exes and whatnot. And yeah, of course, if somebody's sitting there being like, oh, I miss my ex, like obviously that's a complete red flag, but just somebody being able, to me, it's actually a good thing if they can talk about their ex, because to me it means that you have a better emotional understanding of what you went through and what your experiences are. And then once again, myself, it helps to just know what that is, and then vice versa for me to explain what I've been through so that they understand me better.
Yeah. And the person who like left a toxic relationship is in a better, healthy relationship now. I think it just, for them, it takes a little bit longer time to just feel comfortable and easy with a healthy relationship, right? So they're learning to be familiar with a healthy relationship. So it's going to take a little bit of time for them.
So I have another question that's, it's an interesting question. It's one I've actually never thought of before. But what about people who have PTSD nightmares? So somebody who's dealing with, nightmares about past situations that they've dealt with and whatnot. Is there anything you recommend to somebody to, I guess it's hard to control your dreams, but is there something that you would recommend for somebody, maybe they just woke up from a nightmare like that, or, obviously want to prevent them moving forward? Is there anything you recommend there? And is that something you've heard about before?
Yeah, absolutely. Being in narcissistic relationships, you have a lot of nightmares, especially in the beginning, when you leave the relationship. So one of the things I recommend for people who have nightmares is journal. I know it sounds cliche, but journaling really helps process any type of trauma or, PTSD symptoms you're having. I think just writing it down is going to be very helpful. And part of dreams is because the reason why you dream is because you've been thinking about it, whether consciously or subconsciously, throughout the day, and it manifests into your dreams. So when you're just thinking about it subconsciously, and it's part of back of your brain, but you don't really want to talk about it, it basically comes to your dreams, right? So writing it down is so important, and just kind of checking in with yourself each day, and you'll recognize that the dreams actually slowly kind of diminishes.
So let's say hypothetically that somebody just had a narcissistic dream. They woke up from it. And would you recommend like grounding techniques too? Because I feel like after the podcast that I did with Janet, and she was just talking about grounding techniques, I'm like, that would probably be a good thing to like remind yourself where you're at right now, right? So if you're just like, kind of tapping your knees, kind of tapping your nose, things like that Janet recommended for just like reminding yourself what situation you're in right now so that you can like, therefore fall back asleep and kind of put yourself into a better mental state there.
Yeah. So one of the things that I really love is the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 method. And it's like 5 things you see, 4 things you hear, 3 things you smell, 2 things you taste, and 1 thing you touch. And that really helps you stay in the present moment. But also just deep breathing is so valuable. We kind of don't recognize how important just deep breathing is. And there's a way to deep breathe, right? It's like, inhaling, 4 seconds, holding it in for 1, and exhaling it for 8 seconds. That is going to really be helpful in just staying grounded in the present moment.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Breath work is something that I've I feel like I should do that more often. I feel like breath work could help anybody, and that's something. I feel like all these sort of things, grounding techniques, breath work, they're all things that were never really taught. And so then I feel like at some point in your like early, like mid-20s, getting into your 30s and whatnot, somebody starts suggesting these things to you, and it's like it makes a lot of sense of just kind of calming the situation down, slowing it down a little bit, and like allowing your heart rate to calm down a little bit, and just keep that situation from escalating even further. So. Another one of the common questions I received was, how do you communicate with a narcissist in a situation where you can't avoid it? So let's say potentially somebody has a parent who's a narcissist, or a sibling who's a narcissist, somebody they work with who's a narcissist, and they have to have communication with them. Maybe it's an ex that you have a child with, and so you still have to have a relationship with that person. Is there anything you'd recommend on how to handle a situation like that?
Yeah. First and foremost, I want to say that you only have control over what you do and what you say. You don't have control over what the other person does or says, right? So one of the things that I tell people when dealing with a narcissist is using minimal responses. And, we also talk about the gray rocking method, where it's like, again, you're not really responding to them. You're not really reacting to them. So using minimal responses, for example, if, a narcissistic parent is like, why didn't you do this? And why didn't you clean it up? And, you got to do this and you got to do that. Instead of reacting back or defending yourself, use minimal responses like, okay, thank you for letting me know. Period.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's tough for them to respond when you're not giving them anything to respond to.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. No, that makes sense. It's another thing that this is completely a side note, and you got to help me out with this if this even makes sense. But I feel like sometimes when somebody says to somebody, maybe it's the narcissistic person saying to the non-narcissistic person. Wow, narcissist is a hard word to say. Tongue twister.
Say narcissist 5 times.
Yeah, I would struggle with
I've said it so many times, I feel like I articulate it better now.
There we go. So the narcissist says to the other person, "You're crazy," right? And then the other person responds back and is like, "I'm not crazy because of this, this, and this." I feel like a lot of times we do that, where we almost have to like rationalize why we're not the things that they say that we are, when in reality, like by even rationalizing what they're saying, we're almost giving like credit to it. And when it's such like a batshit crazy statement that they're making, like why should we even give it credit? So almost like what you were saying there a second ago of like, just don't like extremely short responses. So if you're in a situation where he's saying you're crazy and you just respond back, "No, I'm not." Would that be something that you would recommend in terms of like better handling that? Because I feel like the common answer is to like, or a common thing that people do is they almost like answer it like, "No, I'm not because of this." And that gives them obviously more ammunition to come back to you.
Listen, narcissists love to argue because they like to one-up you in conversations, and they like to win in conversations, right? So when you're giving in to it, they will go round and round in arguments and, just justifying and rationalizing and making you look out to be the bad guy here, right? So using minimal responses and just saying, okay, or I'll let you know, or thank you for letting me know, or what, just simple and straight to the point, doesn't give you room to over-explain yourself, because over-explaining is kind of like you're coming from a traumatic, moment, and it's like a trauma response.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another one of the common questions was, how do you deal with the guilt and the emotions that you may feel after cutting somebody off? So whether it's an ex, a friend, a family member, somebody who's caused that trauma to you, and now you're starting to cut them off, but you're starting to feel guilt about it, and maybe they're starting to make you feel like you were the problem. And so, how do you get over the guilt of cutting somebody out of your life like that?
Guilt says that I did something bad or I said something bad. Shame is I am bad for doing it or saying it. So one of the things I always let my clients do is write things down. Put a list, right? Write down all the shameful, feelings you have, and write down like a list of guilt, feeling guilty. Just writing those two different lists down is very helpful of recognizing that it isn't your fault, right? Because I think empaths have a way to forgive others and not themselves. And I think you have to really strengthen your sense of self to recognize that it isn't your fault. And your sense of self is who you are. And, you know, when you love yourself, I really do believe in self-love. And I, you know, came to this understanding of self-love after leaving a narcissistic relationship, because I felt like, you know, it's important to recognize your worth, and understand that you are an incredible soul and anybody should be lucky to be with you. And I don't think that's a narcissistic comment. Yeah. I feel like a lot of empaths don't actually feel that way at all. They don't feel worthy of unconditional love. So I think just writing things down and then recognizing like your behavior versus theirs, and seeing the discrepancy there, because sometimes, you know, other people can make you feel kind of crazy and doubt yourself. So writing it down is going to be helpful in reminding you that it isn't your fault.
How do you feel like victimization plays another role in this? Let's say, for example, that you leave that situation where you were dealing with a narcissist, and then they kind of come back to you and they're like, well, because you often hear times where somebody will threaten bodily harm to themselves, right? Like, oh, if you leave me, I'm going to hurt myself, right? And then that person feels like, well, I can't leave that person, right? And they almost feel like they're they're just in a position where they have no options, right? Or a situation where a family member says to you, well, I'm going to cut you out of my will, or I'm going to do this or that, right? And so where they victimize themselves in order to like keep you sucked into the situation. How do you handle that? And because I feel like that's a pretty common situation.
Yeah, very much so. I think narcissists victimizes themselves so much, but they also have a way to threaten someone, right? I've heard survivors say like, oh, like my narcissistic ex said, like, you'll never find anyone better than me. So it's kind of like threatening them to kind of stick around and making the other person feel like, oh, they're never going to find someone else. This is it, right? So I think that's one of the things that kind of gets survivors and people like stuck in the relationship.
Yeah, 100%. Another common thing that I heard a lot about was a anxious attachment style for a lot of people that come out of a relationship where they were dating a narcissist. So what do you recommend for people that may be experiencing an anxious attachment style as they start getting into the dating pool with the next person?
So one of the I love working on attachments, and that's what I do with a lot of my clients. Most people who are in narcissistic relationship or have been in narcissistic relationship have anxious attachment. And for narcissists, they kind of like go back and forth. They're usually more avoidant, but they can be anxious too. It depends on the narcissist, but most empaths and most individuals who are survivors have anxious attachment, and they've developed anxious attachment as a child. So understanding your attachment style and what that looked like as a child and why you would choose someone who is avoidant is really important to understand, right? So anxious attached people, they get very paranoid and anxious when they don't get a text back right away. It's interesting because anxious attachment people, they end up with avoidant, but those are the two that clashes. But a secure attached person and anxious attached person better kind of get along than anxious and avoidant.
That makes sense. Makes sense. So when you're working with a client, what is the typical reason that they come to you? Are they coming to you because they know they're in a relationship with a narcissist? Are they coming to you because they're feeling kind of like your situation when you first saw your therapist, is you felt some type of way and then you realized it was a big part of because of the relationship that you were in? So what is the main reason that people come to you?
I forgot to mention that before I went to my therapist, I Googled like what that relationship looked like. And I think narcissism did come up, and it was just a repetition going to the therapist for the therapist to tell me they're a narcissist. So I definitely, I feel like people who come to me have already kind of Googled it and found some videos that describe the behavior as a narcissist. So a lot of survivors that come to me know a little bit about narcissism, but they have yet to accept that they are a narcissist.
Or you mean that they're dating a narcissist?
That they're dating a narcissist. Yeah.
So, okay. So then let's talk about what that recovery looks like. So what's I guess the typical recovery window? How long does something like that take? What does recovery even look like? What can somebody expect?
So for every person is very different. I think recovery for me was, it took me a good like a year and a half to kind of work through the trauma and the PTSD. So every person is different. For some it takes 6 months, for some it takes years. It really depends. I would say the first thing that we do in therapy is identify the toxic traits that you've experienced in your relationship. Because although narcissists have similar symptoms, I think every narcissist can be very different, right? Because of the type of narcissist they are. Some are covert, some are overt, which is, they either kind of like, our old president where like you can tell there's some like symptoms and like traits there. That's overt narcissist. Like you can tell that person has those traits versus a covert. So it really depends on what type of narcissist they're in. So it's really like identifying it, recognizing it, accepting it is the key. Really being consciously aware that you're with a narcissist. And when they get to a place where my clients stop rationalizing for their behavior, now it's recognizing they're in a trauma bond. And how to break free from the trauma bond is really working through, just starting from the beginning and from beginning like childhood and recognizing that, maybe you're kind of mirroring what you didn't get as a child. So I do a lot of like childhood work that has affected that person to choose someone who is a narcissist.
And then what is that, I guess, how do you help that person who may realize that this isn't going to be something that happens overnight, right? That like going through therapy is something that is a gradual experience, and that recovery is a gradual experience, and that it's not something that just like a month later, a week later, you're going to feel a ton better, that it might take a minute. So how do you help them with knowing that it's okay for it to take a second to get past all the past trauma that you've dealt with?
I think it's about validating their story and recognizing it is hard, because survivors already know it's going to be hard. They understand that it's really hard to get out of a relationship because they've done it in the past. I'm sure a lot of people before they dated a narcissist, they went through normal breakups and they kind of got like listened to like really sad music and they got over it the next day, but not in a narcissistic relationship. And I think that once my clients understand that I recognize that, and I'm also understanding where they're coming from, we're both in an agreement that it's going to take some time.
And so then, okay, let's say somebody starts off, they're going through therapy sessions with you, and let's say they're seeing you. What's typical, like once a week, twice a week? Sorry, I caught you.
Definitely once a week.
Okay, so once a week. So let's say a few days after the therapy session with you, they're dealing with some intense anxiety. Maybe it's as a result of an ex. Maybe it's as a result of a flashback of a memory that they went through. What can somebody do when they're not, they don't have their therapy session coming up, but they're dealing with some crazy anxiety at that moment? What can they do to help lessen that anxiety?
I say distract yourself. And a wonderful way to distract yourself and in the road to healing is, I always say, like, go to nature, go by the ocean and really kind of like take a book or take a journal and really try to distract yourself. And then when you kind of go into nature, it's so healing. I feel like the ocean is so healing. Just kind of going into nature is really healing. So really try to distract yourself if you can. Take a drive to the ocean and come back. You're going to feel like a whole different person again.
Yeah, I think that's something. When I have something stressful, I like to go walk to a coffee shop and just go talk to a nice barista and just get your coffee, get your if they got a muffin. I'm a big muffin guy. So that to me is something where it's like you're just out in the sunlight, getting some sunlight in your system. I never realized actually how much sunlight affected me until I moved out to California, because growing up in Michigan, Michigan actually a few years ago set the record for most days in a row without sunlight, where it was just cloud cover nonstop. I want to say it was like 50 some days in a row. And so for me, all those like really, really gloomy days were something that really affected me. It really, really, I just needed the sunlight in my system. And so I, even moving into the apartment that I'm in now, my previous apartment didn't have overhead lighting, and I felt like that really affected me. And so it's interesting to me to like recognize your environment and like recognize what you need to be in the right environment for you to really thrive. And I feel like the older I get, the more I really recognize like what I need to be, happy and like what I need to, just like help keep my spirits high, because, life is tough. There's always constant stressors that we're going through, but like recognizing what you need to thrive is a super important thing.
Absolutely.
So outside of the driving to the ocean, kind of seeing nature, things like that, is there anything else that you recommend, whether it's a breath work sort of exercise that they can do, or some sort of exercise that somebody can do if let's say they're at work and there's a experience that they have and they only have a few minutes in the bathroom or something like that? Anything that you recommend for people to do to just like quickly try to lessen some of the anxiety that they're feeling?
Anxiety is like energy in the body, right? It's like your nervous system telling you that something's off when it's not. So when you're doing deep breathing and just listening to like maybe like a meditation for even like 2 to 5 minutes, it helps calm the nervous system down. So if we're talking about like a really quick, temporary thing, it would be just listening to meditation. Meditation is so important. I know that's all, like, it feels cliche, right? Like, oh, go meditate, but it helps rewire the nervous system. So, like Calm app, or I use Insight Timer. It's a great app. There's guided meditation where you can just close your eyes, even if like you're in the restroom at work and you have your headphones on. Just like 30 seconds of like relaxing meditation can really help you feel so much more calmer.
Can you also, just as an exercise for people, because we talked a little bit ago about the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Can you walk me through that, and then I'll just do that right now,
yeah.
And then somebody can see that, and if they're going through something and they need to lessen their anxiety real quick, another exercise they can do.
Yeah. So I would say, hey, Mark, describe 5 things you see in the room right now.
Okay. A ton of lights, a microphone, a coffee can, Natalie, and my coffee table book.
And 4 things you hear.
To be honest, it's hard. These are noise canceling headphones, but I hear your voice. I heard my neighbors upstairs kind of making some noise over there, and I can hear myself speaking. And then let's see, I can hear the sound of what the podcast is going to sound like when we're done with it.
Good. 3 things you smell.
My cologne, my sage aroma thing over there, the good old like tea tree oil that I got in there right now, and then my coffee.
2 things you taste.
My coffee and my stale breath after drinking that coffee.
1 thing you touch.
My knee.
Did you think about anything besides those things?
No.
Exactly.
I feel like the first time I heard of the whole like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, that I thought to myself, well, that feels weird, right? And then when you actually do it, I feel like, just like you mentioned a second ago, it's you're not thinking about anything afterwards. And so anything that I was thinking about in that moment, I actually kind of forgot, like, what is my next question going to be? Because after we were done with that, I was taking a second to think about, what do I smell? What do I taste? What do I feel? All of those sorts of things. And so then, it just completely takes anything that you were thinking about and just completely wipes that out of your thought.
Exactly. It's really, the goal is to be in the present moment, right? And when someone's feeling anxious, they think about the what ifs of the future, or they're thinking about the past, right? So the goal is to work on being in the present moment right now, right here.
Okay, so another question that I have for you, and this is one that if you feel comfortable answering this, but specifically speaking on PTSD and narcissistic abuse recovery, do you have any opinion on the latest research showing the benefits of psilocybin?
I can't really comment on that because I haven't done the research myself to be able to give you like my standpoint on it yet.
Yeah, psilocybin's not something that I've actually dealt with before, but it is something that I've read a little bit about, and it does sound like some of the research that we're seeing right now is pretty promising on what it can do to help people with PTSD and with anxiety and things like that. And so I know a few people that swear by it. Some people who just microdose on an extremely regular basis. I'm talking like a super small amount, but they say it really, really helps them every single day. So I think it's interesting, and I think it's important that we have these sort of conversations, because these conversations lead to solutions. And so maybe that is psilocybin down the road. Maybe that's like an extremely normal thing 5-10 years down the road. Or maybe it really is just normalizing things like breath work and normalizing things like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 and some of these different exercises that people can do. Right. Because I still feel like it's something that the average person, if you went up to the average person right now and said, like, if you're dealing with extreme anxiety right now, what do? I feel like most people don't have a plan of how to deal with that. And so therefore, if you're feeling intense anxiety, it's hard to lessen that if you don't have a plan going into it of like, if I experience intense anxiety, this is what I need to do.
Well, I think most people kind of cover it up and by like drinking or like doing drugs or going out, partying, or, any way that they don't have to think about it because it's so extreme. So finding like healthier coping mechanisms is the goal.
Yeah. And I think you made a great point of going to the ocean. I've done that before. Journaling is something that I don't do it consistently enough, but it is something that I enjoy when I do it. And, but even sometimes, as like weird as it sounds, sometimes I'll like literally almost verbalize it out loud to myself. And it's just like, kind of saying to myself, like, hey, you're going to be good. Just like move forward, find a solution. You're going to be good. Like keep pressing forward.
Positive affirmations to yourself. That's great. Yeah.
100%. So last thing, basically, if somebody wants to reach out to you about their experiences, do they have to be based in California? Do you work with people outside of California? And then, can you drop your socials? Where can people find you?
Yeah. Although I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, my license is in California, but I also do narcissistic abuse recovery. I'm a coach as well. So I can really help coach people that are outside of California. But if anybody wants to, see me in person, I have an office in Sherman Oaks, California, and they can go to my website, which we can provide for them.
Yeah, we'll put that in the description of the video for sure.
Yeah, they can, check out my website and just contact me through there. And even with coaching as well, I have 2 different websites. One is for my licensed marriage and family therapist, and the other one is for the coaching purposes.
There we go. Well, send me both those links. I'll make sure those are in the description. Can you drop your Instagram? Where can people find you?
Yes, it's Self-Love Society.
There we go. Is there any underscores or anything?
There is. It's like Self-Love _ Society.
All right. We'll put that once again in the description of the video. Yeah. But no, I appreciate you doing this. I feel like this is something I think therapy is awesome. I think it's a great thing that we started to normalize in society. People going to see a therapist, talking about what they've been through. And I'm a big believer of like, if you want to live your best life, you have to process what you've already been through. And so I think it's really important to have these conversations. And I appreciate you coming out here and doing this.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, even as like a male figure that talks about narcissism. I love talking about it. So thanks for having me.
No problem at all. So for everybody else, thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure to reach out if you guys would like to. And outside of that, have a great day. See you guys.
Bye.